Trang Bom, Vietnam, 17th of February 1968. 3,000 Australian and New Zealand soldiers blocked the main enemy supply route to Saigon. Then at midnight, 400 North Vietnamese regulars attacked their fire support base with rockets, mortars and human wave assaults. What happened over the next 38 days became Australia's largest sustained battle of the entire Vietnam War, and the world's media almost missed it completely. The 1st Australian Task Force moved into position northeast of Saigon on 24th of January 1968. Intelligence warned that a massive communist offensive was coming during the Tet holiday. American and South Vietnamese commanders needed the Australians to block one critical approach to Saigon. The mission: establish fire support bases directly on enemy supply routes and wait for them to attack. Nobody expected the scale of fighting that would follow, and nobody anticipated that while Saigon burned during Tet, 3,000 Australians and New Zealanders would be fighting their own battle 55 kilometers away, in terrain so hostile that even their own reconnaissance troops couldn't operate. But that's exactly what happened. How do you fight a multi-week battle while the world watches somewhere else? How do you defend fire support bases under coordinated ground assault night after night? And why does one of Australia's most significant Vietnam battles remain largely unknown even today? Operation Coburg began with intelligence assessments that proved horrifyingly accurate. American and South Vietnamese reports indicated an imminent communist offensive during the Tet New Year festival. Lieutenant General Frederick Wyand, commander of 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, requested the use of the 1st Australian Task Force to defend vital bases in the Long Binh Ba Hoa complex northeast of Saigon. The Australians agreed, with one condition: 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment would remain at Nui Dat to secure their main base in Phuoc Toi Province in case of attack. On the 24th of January 1968, 1st Australian Task Force headquarters, under Brigadier Ron Hughes, inserted by air into their new area of operations between Bien Hoa and Long Can provinces, approximately 55 kilometers from Nui Dat. The force consisted of 2 battalions: 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment with Victor Company Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, and 7th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. Armour from a squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, supported them. Artillery included 105mm howitzers from the 4th Field Regiment, Royal Australian Artillery, and 161st Royal New Zealand Artillery. Aviation assets and later elements of 3 RAR, including Whisky Company from New Zealand, would also be committed. The area of operations, designated AO Columbus, measured 26 kilometers from east to west and 17 kilometers from north to south. Sparsely inhabited, it sat east of Long Binh between Highway 1 to the south and the Song Dong Nai River to the north. Forest covered the western portion, while grassland predominated in the east. The Australians would establish fire support bases astride communist lines of communication near the village of Trang Bom, positioned to deny the enemy suitable sites for launching 122mm rocket attacks on Bien Hoa Air Base and the massive Long Binh Logistics Depot. Fire support base Andersen was established 1 kilometer north of Trang Bom for easy access to Route 1. Fire support base Harrison sat 10 kilometers to the west. Both bases were positioned so each could support the other if attacked. Intelligence identified enemy forces in AO Columbus, including a battalion group from the Viet Cong 274th Regiment, 5th Division, a battalion of the North Vietnamese 84A Artillery Regiment equipped with rocket launchers and mortars, elements of the Dong Nai Regiment, and main force elements of the 273rd Regiment from the Viet Cong 9th Division. These forces were believed to be waiting to attack nearby American bases as part of the planned offensive. The Australians began intensive patrolling on 25 January. Within days, they were fighting platoon-sized Viet Cong units in bunker complexes throughout the area of operations. On 26 January, B Company, 2 RAR, fought a 2-hour action against about 25 Viet Cong entrenched in a bunker system. The same day, 9 Platoon, C Company, 2 RAR assaulted and occupied a camp, holding it for 19 hours against repeated attacks from a Viet Cong force estimated at company strength. The New Zealanders of Victor Company engaged in skirmishes that resulted in 12 Viet Cong killed and many weapons captured, with 2 New Zealanders wounded. Contact intensity increased on 27th of January, with 14 Australians wounded and 1 Viet Cong killed. The heavy enemy presence prevented even the SAS from operating normally. The first attempt to insert a patrol was called off due to hostile forces near the landing zone. 2 Viet Cong were killed, and the patrol extracted after only 30 minutes. A second attempt lasted 15 minutes longer before extraction following brief contact. 2 patrols were combined for protection on 29th of January, patrolling out from 7 RAR Battalion headquarters. After 30 minutes, they encountered a small party of Viet Cong. They tried again 2 hours later but were detected. The next day, they tried a third time and were contacted again. Unable to operate effectively, the SAS patrols withdrew and returned to Nui Dat on 1st February. On 29th of January, D Company, 7 RAR contacted a battalion concentrating in bunkers during a 2.5-hour battle. 9 Australians became casualties, including 1 killed, while 7 Viet Cong were also killed. Then on 31st of January, the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam. Viet Cong overran the village of Trang Bom, just 1,500 meters southwest of Fire Support Base Andersen. The Australians reclaimed it that afternoon in savage house-to-house fighting involving D Company, 2 RAR and A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment. The Viet Cong attacked again the next day. Once again, the Australians recaptured the village in brutal close-quarters combat. The lead platoon from D Company, 7 RAR, advanced on what was later discovered to be a battalion-sized Viet Cong camp. They were almost destroyed in the firefight that followed. With half the platoon becoming casualties, another platoon moved forward to aid extraction. Close artillery support protected the Australians from further casualties and eventually forced the Viet Cong to withdraw. 6 Australians had been killed and 36 wounded in engagements up to that point, while 1 New Zealander had died and 1 was wounded. More than 40 Viet Cong had been killed and 9 wounded. In the early hours of 31st January, key installations in the Long Binh Bien Hoa complex came under heavy attack by the Viet Cong 5th Division as part of attacks against Saigon itself. Bien Hoa Air Base received heavy rocket fire, causing extensive damage to buildings, aircraft and facilities. The Long Binh Logistics Depot and prisoner of war camp were also hit. Over 3 days, the US 199th Light Infantry Brigade, reinforced by the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment and an infantry battalion from the 101st Airborne Division, fought heavy combat, fending off communist indirect fire and ground attacks. By 1st February, the Americans had gained the upper hand, clearing the last remaining enemy from Bien Hoa. The attacks on Bien Hoa forced tactical changes for the Australians. The mission quickly shifted from reconnaissance in force to blocking operations designed to intercept withdrawing communist forces. Between 31st January and 1st February, Australian battalions moved into company blocking positions. Minor contacts resulted in Viet Cong casualties and capture of weapons and equipment. Once in position, clash intensity increased as the Australians sprung platoon ambushes. During early February, contacts in AO Columbus changed character, with Australians increasingly facing larger company-sized main force units in static defensive positions. During the first week of February, the Viet Cong began streaming through the area of operations, retreating from Saigon after heavy losses during Tet. Although the Viet Cong avoided decisive engagement, around 90 were killed and 5 captured as Australians maintained blocking positions. C Company, 7 RAR, was particularly heavily engaged during this phase. 6 kilometers north of Trang Bom on the morning of 5th February, the company contacted a large Viet Cong force consisting of a regimental headquarters and 3 companies in a well-constructed defensive position defended by several heavy machine guns. The Australians assaulted the position 3 times over the next 3 days in vicious fighting supported by airstrikes, artillery and helicopter gunships. During one attack on 7th of February, Lieutenant Mark Moloney, one of the company's platoon commanders, charged forward with 6 rocket launchers to attack bunkers single-handed. Moloney destroyed several before falling badly wounded. He survived and for his actions was recommended for a Victoria Cross. The award was never made, although Gunner Michael Williams and Corporal Graham Griffith were both awarded the military medal for actions under fire. The battle continued for 7 hours, with Australians eventually routing defenders in what was later described as probably one of the most brilliant actions ever fought by an Australian rifle company. However, amid the confusion of Tet, such efforts went largely unnoticed by the press. Early the same morning, the night harbour occupied by New Zealanders from Victor Company was attacked by a Viet Cong force consisting of elements of 3 companies from the 274th Regiment, shortly after stand to at 06:15. The incident proved to be the most intense fighting involving New Zealand forces in South Vietnam to that point. Over the course of an hour, the attack was successfully repelled with assistance from highly accurate artillery support from the 108th Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, and mortar fire. The Viet Cong withdrew following arrival of helicopter gunships, leaving behind 13 dead and numerous blood trails. 9 New Zealanders were wounded in the engagement, 6 requiring evacuation by helicopter. Elsewhere, Tet had also engulfed Phuoc Tuy province. The remaining Australian forces there were drawn into heavy combat as Viet Cong units simultaneously attacked main provincial towns. A company, 3 RAR under Major Brian Howard, moved to reinforce South Vietnamese government forces following attack by a 600-strong force from the Viet Cong D445 Battalion on Ba Raya, the provincial capital, before first light on 1st of February. Fighting street to street in close-quarters firefights, the Australians successfully repelled the attack, killing 40 Viet Cong. Later, on 3rd of February, D Company, 3 RAR spoiled a harassing attack on Long Dien and conducted a sweep of Hoa Long. Overall, fighting in Phuoc Tuy between 1 and 9th of February resulted in 50 Viet Cong killed, 25 wounded, and 1 prisoner. 5 Australians were killed and 24 wounded. 1 New Zealander was killed with 9 wounded. While Australians in AO Columbus had successfully interrupted pre-positioning of communist forces on one main approach to Saigon, in hindsight, they had been deployed too late to interfere seriously with the offensive itself. Over 9 to 12th other February, 1st Australian Task Force redeployed, moving south back towards the fire support bases. Remaining companies of 3 RAR relieved 7 RAR and moved north on 11th February, with Whiskey Company from New Zealand joining them on 12th of February. TUS RAR and Victor Company returned to Nui Dat on 13th of February. Fire Support Base Harrison was abandoned, and all command and support elements concentrated at Fire Support Base Andersen. Contact was minimal during this period, with just 3 Viet Cong killed. The Australian defence of Fire Support Base Andersen was left to 3 RAR, M113 armoured personnel carriers from 1 Troop A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, and a troop of engineers from 1st Field Squadron. Artillery support came from 161st Field Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, and American 155mm self-propelled medium guns of B Battery, 2nd Battalion, 35th Artillery Regiment. A radar detachment from 131st Divisional Locating Battery was attached, along with elements of 161st Reconnaissance Flight. A company, 3 RAR together with supporting arms defended the base, while the other 3 rifle companies and New Zealanders of Whiskey Company continued reconnaissance in force operations throughout the area. Airstrikes and artillery targeted known Viet Cong base areas, but ground contacts remained limited. Late on the evening of 17th of February into 18th of February, the Communists launched their assault on Fire Support Base Andersen. The first attack was preceded by heavy rocket and mortar barrage in the early hours of morning, followed by 2 waves of infantry each of company size. The attack focused on the southwest perimeter, manned by 3 RAR's echelon and mortar platoon, and an American medium artillery battery. The perimeter wire was breached, but the attack was repulsed by mortar counter-battery fire, claymore mines, and heavy machine gun fire from armored personnel carriers and American gunners. The communist barrage had devastating effect, falling among American and New Zealand gun positions, mortar lines and battalion echelon, scoring a direct hit on an Australian engineer standing patrol. A second attack shortly after, this time from the north, was repelled by small arms fire from forward Australian positions. Total Viet Cong casualties were unknown, although 4 bodies were found on the wire at dawn. Numerous bloodstains and bandages were found during later perimeter sweeps. 7 Australians and 1 American were killed. 22 Australians and 3 Americans were wounded. Due to growing threat to the Australian base, the decision was made to reinforce Fire Support Base Andersen, with C Company 3 RAR flown in before the second attack 2 nights later. The armoured personnel carriers were redeployed to cover the southeast ridge and southern approach from Trang Bom. The communist assault commenced just before midnight on 19th of February, this time focusing on the southeast. Preceded by heavy machine gun fire, the attack was stopped short of the wire. Forward positions were hit by rifle grenades, while assault pioneer positions were attacked with satchel charges. The only casualties were 4 Viet Cong killed. The final attack on 28th of February began with a mortar attack, but the assault wave was broken up by mortar fire and forced to withdraw east. 3 Americans were wounded. A clearing patrol later revealed that the Viet Cong had inserted a mortar team to the edge of rubber trees by night in a lambretta and a cart, then manhandled the tubes into position. The defense of Fire Support Base Andersen was the first occasion in their operations in South Vietnam that an Australian fire support base had been subjected to ground assault. During all 3 attacks, the cavalry and artillery in support played key roles in defense. Throughout the later operation, patrolling rifle companies systematically searched the area of operations, and although contact was infrequent, patrols were effective in denying subsequent use of the area to launch rocket attacks against bases in Long Binh and Bien Hoa. Operation Coburg ended on 1st March 1968, with 3 RAR and Whiskey Company redeploying to Nui Dat by air. The fighting had cost the Australians 17 killed and 61 wounded. Allied casualties included 2 New Zealanders killed and 15 wounded. Communist casualties included at least 145 killed, 110 wounded, and 5 captured, with many more removed from the battlefield. Large quantities of weapons and equipment were also captured by the Australians. Overall, Coburg was considered a success by Australians and Americans. Although inserted too late to prevent attacks during Tet, 1st Australian Task Force had successfully disrupted communist lines of communication, limiting their freedom of maneuver to attack the Long Binh Bien Hoa complex. The Australians had also successfully interdicted the Viet Cong withdrawal, causing heavy casualties. The operation was significant because it had been the first deployment of 1st Australian Task Force outside Phuoc Tuy, setting a precedent for later operations outside the province. The Royal Australian Regiment and 3rd Cavalry Regiment were subsequently awarded the battle honour Bien Hoa, one of only 5 presented to Australian units during the war. At the strategic level, the general uprising never eventuated, and in late February, the offensive collapsed. Suffering more than 45,000 killed against South Vietnamese and Allied losses of only 6,000, it had been a tactical disaster for the Communists. Regardless, the offensive was a turning point in the war. The scale of fighting and surprise with which the offensive was launched shocked the public, contradicting predictions of imminent victory. Confidence in military and political leadership collapsed, as did public support for the war in America. Tet was a publicity triumph for the Communists. In its wake, President Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek a second term in office. Tet had similar effect on Australian public opinion, causing growing uncertainty in government about United States' determination to remain militarily involved in Southeast Asia. Prime Minister John Gorton unexpectedly declared that Australia would not increase its military commitment beyond the current level of 8,000 personnel. The war continued without respite, however. Between May and June 1968, 1st Australian Task Force was again deployed away from Phuoc Tuy in response to intelligence reports of another impending offensive. But that deployment would be even more costly. The Australians took up positions northeast of Saigon during Operation Tuan Thang to interdict communist lines of communication. What followed became known as the Battle of Coral Balmoral. Fire Support Base Coral, established on 12 May 1968, about 7 kilometers north of Tan Nguyen, came under repeated ground assault. Between 12 May and 6 June 1968, 25 Australian lives were lost, with many more wounded. These actions made up Australia's most costly and protracted battle of the entire Vietnam War. A battle where Australian soldiers fought surrounded, outnumbered, under nightly assault for 26 straight days. If you want more real operations from Australian forces in Vietnam, subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. Which battle do you want detailed next? Let me know what interests you. Until then.